With wars escalating in Ukraine and the Middle East against Iran's proxies and the very real threat of the US dollar collapsing as the world's reserve currency, we are watching history violently repeat itself. Ray Dalio warns that we are following the exact same big cycle of the 1930s, a time when rising global conflict and massive debt bubbles caused Wall Street to crash, assets to be frozen, and governments to completely go broke. If these modern tensions explode into World War III, Ray Dalio predicts markets will face unprecedented wealth destruction and hyperinflation as desperate nations print endless fiat money just to survive the chaos. You need to understand these hidden financial patterns right now to protect your savings before the entire global system breaks down. Here are 15 lessons from How Countries Go Broken by Ray Dalio that you need to know. We're talking 7 lessons first.
Yeah, that is quite the introduction.
I mean, it's intense, right?
Oh, absolutely. But it's necessary because when you look at Ray Dalio's latest work, his framework is, well, it's staggering.
Right. And for everyone listening to this deep dive today, I want to assure you right off the bat, we aren't framing this as some hopeless doomsday scenario.
No, not at all.
Think of it like a map. We are going to extract the mechanics of how global powers rise and fall so that you can actually navigate the terrain ahead.
It's a vital map to have right now. I mean, the events dominating our news feeds today, things that feel so chaotic to us, they're actually remarkably predictable.
If you pull back.
Exactly. If you pull back and look at the broader historical timeline, Dalio has spent his career studying these massive, roughly 80-year cycles. He looks at debt limits, central banking, imperial rise and fall. It covers hundreds of years of data and like 35 major debt crises.
Wow.
Yeah. So when you understand the underlying mathematics of those past crises, the current geopolitical chaos suddenly looks like clockwork.
Which means we can logically break it down. If we know what happened, we can anticipate the future. So let's just jump right in. Lesson 1, the world at war, Ukraine, Iran, and why history is repeating itself. We have to start by looking at how these localized conflicts, the tragic events happening on the other side of the planet. Dalio argues they are not isolated flare-ups.
No, they aren't. They are the early, very predictable tremors of a massive economic earthquake.
A massive earthquake.
Yeah. The historical parallels are just impossible to ignore here. Dalio identifies our current global state as what he calls stage 5 of the big cycle.
Okay, stage 5. What does that actually mean?
Well, to truly grasp stage 5, you have to look at the periods of, say, 1905 to 1914.
So right before World War I.
Exactly. And then 1933 to 1938, the lead up to World War II. The conflicts we see today, like Russia's invasion of Ukraine or the proxy wars in the Middle East, they are the modern manifestations of this exact stage.
I mean, when you say we're in stage 5, my first instinct is to look at our current political polarization and just assume it's, I don't know, a byproduct of social media algorithm.
Right, the tech aspect.
Yeah, the 24-hour news cycles. Are you saying this exact type of cultural divide happened in the 1930s, long before the internet?
Absolutely. The technology amplifies it today, sure. But the root cause is economic. It always is.
Okay.
Stage 5 is fundamentally characterized by highly indebted nations experiencing massive wealth gaps. When the economic pie shrinks, or, when the vast majority of the wealth gets concentrated at the very top, populations become deeply dissatisfied.
Right. People feel like the system is rigged against them.
Exactly. Yeah. And that dissatisfaction breeds extreme polarization. We are seeing a massive structural squaring off right now between the hard right, so capitalists and nationalists, and the hard left, socialists and progressives.
Now, I want to pause us right there just for a second. This is crucial for you listening. We need to explicitly state that we are not taking sides here.
Absolutely not.
We are not endorsing any political viewpoint, left or right. We are impartially reporting Dalio's historical analysis of these polarizations, just observing the data exactly as the source material lays it out.
Precisely. Because from a purely analytical standpoint, this polarization is dangerous because domestic disorder directly fuels international disorder.
Oh, interesting. How so?
Well, when democracies become too divisive to function efficiently, when the opposing sides view each other not just as rivals, but as existential enemies.
Which feels very familiar right now.
Right. Leaders lose the ability to compromise. The legislative process paralyzes. And to bypass that paralysis, leaders often turn to autocratic measures at home. But more importantly, for the global cycle, to project strength, They turn their focus toward external conflicts.
Ah, it's the classic rally around the flag effect.
Exactly.
Like if a country is a pressure cooker, for decades their least valves were things like diplomacy and global trade, multilateralism. But now those valves have completely rusted shut.
That's a great way to put it.
So the internal pressure builds until it explodes outward. But wait, if we've seen this exact chain reaction before in 1914 and 1939, why do modern leaders keep walking to the same trap? Don't they know history?
You think so, but the incentives haven't changed. When a superpower is dealing with intense internal strife, rival nations see an opportunity.
They smell blood in the water.
Right. They calculate that the distracted superpower won't have the political will to fight back, so they make aggressive moves for resources or territory. And simultaneously, the domestic leaders of the fractured superpower realize the only way to unite their angry citizens is by pointing them at a common foreign enemy.
Wow. So if you are listening to this and wondering how to interpret the evening news, the takeaway here is to observe these shifts impartially. We have to recognize that the era of global cooperation is actively breaking down.
It is. We are shifting back to a unilateral survival of the fittest mentality. You really need to adjust your expectations for global stability. The era of peaceful globalization is on pause.
And these regional wars are just proxies, right?
Yeah, merely proxies. The real conflict is the collision of the world's actual superpowers.
Right, which naturally launches us into the next point. Lesson 2, World War III and the fall of empires. Because what happens when an unstoppable, rising economic power collides head-on with an immovable, heavily indebted reigning empire? That is the defining tension of our time.
It really is. And historians actually have a name for this structural dynamic. It's called the Thucydides trap.
The Thucydides trap.
Right. It describes the inevitable severe tension that occurs when a rising power threatens to displace a ruling one. And obviously, we're watching this play out between the United States and China.
Right.
Dalio views this relationship not just as a standard political rivalry, but as the climax of an 80-year global cycle that began in 1945.
Because the U.S. wrote all the rules after World War II.
Exactly. They had the most wealth, the most military power. But now, that absolute dominance is being challenged.
And the strategies these two powers use are fundamentally different. I mean, the source text shares an incredible anecdote from a senior Chinese leader explaining their approach, and it contrasts so sharply with the West.
It's a vital distinction to understand. Western powers typically favor a Mediterranean approach to conflict.
Meaning?
It's direct, kinetic, aggressive, a head-on collision. You meet on the battlefield, and the one with the biggest guns wins.
Very brute force.
Right. But China, conversely, favors a much more subtle, multi-generational approach. It's rooted deeply in Sun Tzu's The Art of War.
Emphasizing deception.
Yes, deception and winning the war before a single battle is actually fought, alongside ancient Confucian principles of Datong, which translates roughly to grand harmony.
Right. So they aren't looking for some cinematic military showdown because a kinetic war destroys wealth.
Exactly.
They're playing a much longer, deeper economic game.
Spot on. This great power conflict doesn't start with military deployments. It starts with supply chains,
Right.
trade wars, aggressive technology embargoes on advanced microchips and artificial intelligence. It's a frantic race for absolute self-sufficiency.
Which is what economists are calling onshoring and friendshoring now, right?
Yes, exactly. The goal is to ensure that critical supplies, everything from pharmaceuticals to semiconductors, cannot be cut off by a foreign adversary.
And as a reaction, the U.S. is fundamentally changing its posture, too. For decades, we played the role of the cooperative leader of a globalized world. But now we're seeing a massive shift toward America First nationalism, basically regardless of which political party is in power.
Yeah, that protectionist paradigm shift is huge. Dalio points out that this historically signals the twilight of an empire's absolute dominance.
But let me push back a bit here. Our modern economies are so incredibly tangled up together. China holds U.S. debt. The U.S. relies on Chinese manufacturing. Doesn't that level of economic interdependence make World War III simply too expensive for either side to actually fight?
That is the logical, rational assumption, sure, but it's also the exact same assumption economists made in 1913.
Wait, really?
Oh yeah, right before World War I, global trade and interdependence were at all-time highs. People wrote books claiming war was obsolete because it would be economic suicide.
Oh, wow, I didn't know that.
But history shows that when a cycle reaches the desperation of stage 5, financial logic is just discarded in favor of existential survival and power. The perceived cost of losing dominance suddenly outweighs the devastating cost of the conflict.
That is terrifying. So if you are trying to understand where we are, look beyond the military headlines. Track the economic battle lines. Semiconductor facilities, AI research, rare earth minerals, those are the real battlefields.
Because when the conflict escalates from economic maneuvering to overt hostility, the fallout won't just be contained overseas.
Exactly. The ultimate battlefield is going to be in your bank account. Which brings us to lesson 3, Wall Street and wartime. What happens to your money? If this powder keg ignites, what actually happens to your savings, your 401k, the physical cash in your wallet? I think a lot of people assume, oh, the stock market dips 20%, maybe inflation ticks up. But Dalio's data says the reality is exponentially more extreme.
Much, much more extreme. The core mechanism here is that when countries reach the absolute breaking point of debt, combined with war costs, governments are forced to employ extreme measures. Measures that citizens previously thought were, frankly, unimaginable in a free society.
Right. We aren't just talking about raising taxes a little bit.
No, we are talking about capital controls and asset seizures.
Asset seizures.
Yes. The text points to stark examples. In 1941, the U.S. froze Japanese assets. We saw the exact same playbook recently with the freezing of Russian central bank assets.
Right. That makes huge news.
But it happens domestically, too. Look at 1933. To combat a severe debt crisis, President Franklin D. Roosevelt literally broke the gold standard with Executive Order 6102.
Okay, remind us what that order actually did.
He made it illegal for private American citizens to hoard gold coin or bullion. He forced them to sell it to the government at a fixed price and then immediately devalue the dollar.
Wait, literally illegal. They just took it.
They forced you to exchange it for paper money, and then they devalued the paper money overnight. Or look at the UK in the 1970s. They suffered a massive financial collapse, resulting in brutal currency devaluation and capital controls. They legally restricted how much money citizens could even take out of the country.
Wow. And Dalio lists 15 red flags of these late-stage debt cycles. Human psychology plays a massive role here, doesn't it? What do people actually do when they see the financial system cracking?
Well, they panic. Capital flees. High net worth individuals, terrified of wealth confiscation or punitive wartime taxes, start quietly moving their money abroad into safer jurisdictions.
Because they can see the writing on the wall.
Exactly. And everyday citizens, they start aggressively buying real physical goods, anything tangible, just to outrun the inflation they know is coming. Domestic savers lose faith in their currency and scramble to buy foreign stocks or hard assets.
And we have historical data on how different asset classes perform during these sovereign debt crises.
Right. We do. Dalio's data shows that during major currency devaluations, gold historically rises an average of 81% in local currency terms. Broad commodities rise around 55%. Meanwhile, nominal government bonds, which most financial advisors tell you are the safest investment on earth, they suffer catastrophic losses in real purchasing power.
Let's explain the mechanics of why that happens, because it's tied to what Dalio calls the doom loop. War, or massive peacetime social spending, requires unprecedented government borrowing. The Treasury issues bonds. But what happens when the free market, so regular investors, pension funds, foreign governments, looks at that debt pile, looks at inflation and says, no thanks, the yield is too low, that's too risky.
That refusal by the free market is the exact trigger for the doom loop. The government still needs the money to fund the military or keep the lights on. So if the free market won't buy the bonds, the central bank is forced to step in as the buyer of last resort.
Right.
Central bank prints money. Mechanically, they just credit bank reserves out of thin air to buy the government's debt.
This is quantitative easing, QE.
Exactly. But by injecting trillions of newly created currency units into the financial system, they dilute the value of the currency that already exists. They are essentially stealing purchasing power from the dollars in your savings account to fund the government's deficit.
It's like the bond market becomes a game of musical chairs. Except the chairs are made of paper money, and the government is the one simultaneously taking away the chairs and handing out the matches.
That's a highly accurate and vivid way to visualize it.
You absolutely do not want to be left sitting on a pile of cash or long-term government bonds when inflation catches fire.
If you are listening and worrying about your portfolio, the takeaway is you must radically diversify your concept of a safe asset. You have to understand that in a sovereign debt crisis, holding government bonds isn't risk-free. They're almost guaranteed to lose purchasing power because the government will deliberately devalue the currency to manage its own debt.
To protect your wealth, you have to stop reacting to the daily news cycle and start watching the hidden structural clockwork. Which brings us to lesson 4, the big cycle. how the world order changes. What if the geopolitical chaos, the inflation, the political polarization, what if none of it is random?
Right.
Dalio's framework maps out 5 invisible forces working together like a perpetual motion machine that dictates the rise and fall of nations.
It's an incredibly powerful lens through which to view history. The foundational concept is that human productivity naturally slopes upward over time. We invent things, we become more efficient, living standards generally improve.
The long-term upward trajectory.
Yes. However, revolving around that steady upward slope are 5 massive cyclical forces that cause violent, volatile swings. Booms, busts, periods of peace, and devastating war.
Let's break down those 5 forces mechanically. What exactly is driving this machine?
Well, force number 1 is the debt and money cycle. Force number 2 is the internal order cycle, which governs domestic politics, wealth gaps, and civil conflict. Force number 3 is the external order cycle, governing geopolitics, the rise of rival powers, and war. Force number 4 encompasses acts of nature, so pandemics, severe droughts, climate change.
Unpredictable shocks.
Exactly. And force number 5 is human inventiveness, primarily the rapid evolution of technology.
I want to zoom in on that first force, the money cycle, because we have actually lived through several distinct eras of it. Dalio categorizes the progression of monetary policies from MP0 to MP3. Can you walk us through those eras?
Certainly. So MP0 was the era from roughly 1945 to 1971. This was the era of hard money, established by the Bretton Woods Agreement. The U.S. dollar was physically linked to gold at a fixed price.
Which provided immense stability.
It did. But eventually, the U.S. government spent way too much on the Vietnam War and domestic programs. They printed more paper claims than they had actual gold in the vault.
Oh, I see.
Foreign nations realized this and started demanding their gold back. The U.S. was basically facing a run on Fort Knox.
So in 1971, President Nixon goes on television and completely severs the tie between the dollar and gold.
Precisely. That historic default ushered in MP1, the era of fiat money. From 1971 all the way to 2008, currency was backed by nothing but faith in the government. During MP1, central banks managed the economy primarily through interest rates.
Right, so if the economy runs too hot, they raise rates to make borrowing expensive. If it slows down, they lower rates to spur credit creation.
Exactly. But by 2008, during the Great Financial Crisis, the system broke. Central banks dropped interest rates to absolute zero, but the economy was still collapsing.
They ran out of traditional ammunition.
They did. And that forced the shift to MP2.
Which is the era of quantitative easing that we talked about earlier.
Correct. From 2008 to roughly 2020, we lived in MP2. This was fiat money, combined with aggressive debt monetization. Because interest rates were stuck at zero, central banks simply printed trillions of dollars to buy financial assets, primarily government bonds and mortgage-backed securities, directly from banks.
But the problem with MP2 is that the money largely stayed trapped in the financial system, right?
Exactly. It inflated stock prices and real estate, making asset owners incredibly wealthy. But it didn't create enough wage growth for the average working person. It dramatically worsened the wealth gap.
And then the pandemic hit in 2020, which acted as this intense catalyst, forcing the final shift into MP3.
Yes. MP3 is where you're living right now. It is defined by coordinated massive fiscal deficits combined with debt monetization.
Meaning the government borrows trillions to fund massive deficit spending. The central bank prints the money to buy that debt, and then the government routes that money directly into the hands of citizens and corporations.
Think of the pandemic stimulus checks, PPP loans, massive infrastructure bills.
Which predictably ignited the worst inflation we've seen in 40 years. And Dalio warns that we are currently maxing out MP3. There really isn't an MP4.
No, the policy tools are exhausted at this point. Historically, when a system reaches the end of MP3, the next stage is a massive, painful deleveraging or a complete currency reset.
But wait, what about the fifth force? Human inventiveness. If we look at the explosive growth of artificial intelligence right now, couldn't a massive leap in productivity generate enough wealth to allow us to simply outgrow the debt cycle? Can technology bail us out?
It's the ultimate hope, right? But Dalio's historical analysis offers a very sobering reality check. He notes that while new technologies, whether it's AI today or the internet in the 90s or electricity and railroads in the 19th century, they undoubtedly create massive productivity booms and mint new paper billionaires.
What?
But they have historically never been enough to overpower the destructive headwinds when the other 4 forces turned severely negative. The invention of the combustion engine and the telegraph didn't stop the Great Depression or World War I.
That is a harsh truth. Technology doesn't fix a broken monetary system.
Or cure deep-seated geopolitical hatred, unfortunately.
So for everyone listening, if you want to understand where we are heading, evaluate the world using this five-force dashboard. When you see extreme debt levels aligning with intense domestic polarization, while simultaneously facing the geopolitical threat of a rising foreign power, you have to recognize a systemic breakdown is mathematically imminent. A new world order is being forged.
And that means we need to deeply understand the engine driving this entire crisis. We have to look closely at the most immediate threat to your purchasing power, the mechanics of the big debt cycle itself.
Lesson 5, Part 1, the hidden danger of the big debt cycle. We need to talk about why the booming, prosperous economy we've seemingly enjoyed for much of the last decade was largely an illusion. It felt like real growth, but mathematically it was a financial cancer feeding on our future purchasing power.
To understand why it's a cancer, we have to examine the fundamental mechanics of how debt functions in an economy. Dalio draws a critical distinction between the 6-year short-term debt cycle and the 80-year big debt cycle.
Right.
Everyone is familiar with the short-term cycle. The economy falls into a recession, so the central bank lowers interest rates to make borrowing cheap. People take out mortgages, businesses take out loans, the economy booms. Eventually, that credit expansion causes inflation to rise, so the central bank raises rates to cool things down, which triggers the next recession.
And that oscillation takes roughly 6 to 10 years.
Exactly. But here's the fatal flaw in the system. Every time they restart that short-term cycle, they never actually allow the economy to clear out all the old bad debt. When the recession hits, it's too painful to let failing companies go bankrupt, so central banks cut rates again before the system fully deleverages. As a result, every single short-term cycle ends with a higher baseline of total debt than the last one.
So it just piles up.
Over a period of roughly 80 years, these accumulated layers of debt build up to form the peak of the big debt cycle. And at its core, you have to understand what a debt actually is. A debt is simply a contractual promise to deliver money in the future.
Okay.
A systemic crisis happens when society has created vastly more promises to deliver money than actual productive money exists in the system.
Which eventually forces the central bank into a terrifying binary dilemma. When the debt burden gets so heavy that the interest payments are consuming the entire economy, the math just breaks.
They only have two choices, right?
They do. They must choose between default or devaluation.
Default or devaluation.
Right. If policymakers choose default, they stop printing money and force debtors to actually pay what they owe. Because the money isn't there, massive defaults occur. Banks fail, businesses shutter, unemployment skyrockets.
So a deflationary depression, much like the early 1930s. Exactly. It cleans the bad debt out of the system, but the human and social cost is devastating. The alternative choice is devaluation. The central bank creates enough new money out of thin air to cover all the bad debts and government deficits, which inevitably causes severe inflation or hyperinflation.
And Dalio has a hard, historically proven rule about this dilemma. Because choosing hard money, allowing a deflationary depression to run its course, is politically and socially just too painful for any leader to endure, central banks always eventually choose to print and devalue.
Every single time in recorded economic history, politicians will always choose the printing press over austerity.
Yeah.
Because austerity gets them voted out of office or overthrown.
Right.
But the critical threshold you have to watch for, the mathematical tipping point where you know the end of the big cycle is imminent, is when a country or even a corporation has to borrow new money just to pay the interest on its old debt.
I think of the big debt cycle like relying on caffeine to function. The short-term debt cycles are your daily cups of coffee. You feel a little sluggish, which is a recession, so you drink a cup of coffee.
Right.
The credit gives you a boost, you get back to work.
Perfect analogy.
But the big debt cycle is what happens when you've stayed awake for 80 straight days, just drinking exponentially more coffee to fight off exhaustion. Eventually, it doesn't matter how much caffeine you pump into your system, your organs begin to shut down.
Yeah.
The stimulant that used to give you energy has literally become toxic.
That perfectly captures the life cycle of credit. Early in the big cycle, debt is incredibly productive. You borrow money to build a manufacturing plant, the plant generates real revenue, the debt pays for itself. It feels like real wealth creation, because it is. But late in the cycle, the debt is entirely unproductive. You're borrowing money just to consume, or worse, borrowing just to service the interest on previous loans.
The step action for you listening is to monitor the debt service to income ratio, whether it's a national economy or your own household budget. A healthy financial state exists only when the income generated by your productivity vastly outpaces your debt payments. The moment you are borrowing just to tread water, the death spiral has begun.
But the truly dangerous part is that because this cycle spans multiple generations, people forget what sound money actually looks like. Early in the bubble, the massive influx of credit feels exactly like actual cash in the bank. It feels amazing.
Which brings us to lesson 6, the credit illusion. How countries build fake wealth. How do entirely rational people, brilliant investors, CEOs, everyday families, mistake a mountain of IOUs for a mountain of actual wealth? How does an entire society get hypnotized by the credit illusion?
It happens slowly during the generational transition from the sound money stage to the debt bubble stage. The core insight here is recognizing the fundamental mechanical difference between money and credit.
Great, break that down.
Money settles a transaction immediately and finally. If I buy your car with a gold coin or even a stack of physical $100 bills, the transaction is completely over. Neither of us owes the other anything. Credit, however, leaves a lingering obligation.
Okay.
If I give you a piece of paper promising to pay you next month, that is credit. I've consumed your asset, but I still owe you the value.
And the magic trick of the modern financial system is that anyone can create credit out of thin air simply by making a promise.
Exactly. A bank doesn't need to have $1 million in a vault to lend you $1 million. They literally just type the credit into your account. Because credit is so effortless to create, it grows exponentially faster than actual money or real economic output.
And during the bubble stage, society collectively mistakes this abundant, easily accessible credit for real wealth.
Yes, and Dalio uses the perfect modern example, the unicorn startup.
Huh.
You have a tech company that is valued at over $1 billion on paper, turning its young founders into billionaires overnight. Yet the company has only actually raised $50 million in real capital and has never turned a profit.
The billion-dollar valuation is a complete illusion. It's just based on what one venture capital firm paid for a tiny fraction of a percent share in the latest funding round, based on the assumption that there will always be endless cheap credit to fuel the next round.
Yes, that is the exact psychology of a late-stage bubble. Dalio notes that in this stage, meme investing overtakes rational analysis. People buy assets, whether it's tech stocks, cryptocurrencies, real estate, simply because the price has been going up.
They ignore the fundamentals.
They completely ignore traditional financial metrics like the present value of future cash flows.
Yeah.
They don't care what the asset actually earns. They just assume the central bank will keep credit flowing, allowing them to sell the asset to a greater fool tomorrow at a higher price.
And the statistic in Dalio's text regarding this is absolutely staggering. From 2009 to roughly 2024, U.S. household paper wealth tripled. It skyrocketed from $32 trillion to $99 trillion. But wait, I have to push back here on behalf of anyone listening who owns a home or a 401k. If my retirement account tripled in value and my house is now worth twice what I paid for it, didn't I actually get richer? Isn't that real wealth?
It feels incredibly real, but structurally, it is what Dalio calls wealth created out of nothing. It is imagined wealth. It was artificially inflated by central banks suppressing interest rates to zero and pumping trillions in quantitative easing into the financial system.
Not by actual productivity.
Right. It was not driven by a tripling of actual underlying economic output.
Mm-hmm.
The danger of this illusion is the liquidity trap. Everyone assumes they can convert those paper assets, their stocks, their home equity, back into real, tangible goods whenever they want.
But when a systemic shock occurs,
Confidence breaks,
Yeah.
and everyone tries to cash out at the exact same time.
and that's when they realize the actual money isn't there to support those valuations.
Precisely. The credit evaporates, the buyers disappear, the illusion shatters, resulting in either a catastrophic crash in asset prices, or, if the central bank steps in to print enough money to buy everything, hyperinflation that destroys the purchasing power of the currency you just cashed out into.
So all that wealth was just a hallucination fueled by cheap debt. If you are sitting there looking at your brokerage account, the takeaway here is that you need to be brutally honest and audit your own net worth. You must distinguish between your actual productive assets, businesses, land, or investments that generate real inflation-adjusted cash flow, and your paper wealth that is merely inflated by central bank credit and market memes. Because when the music stops, the paper burns.
And that inevitably leads us to the final, critical mechanism.
Right. If the credit illusion is guaranteed to shatter, what does the actual collapse look like mechanically? How does a global superpower officially go bankrupt? Lesson 7. Part 2. The Blueprint of National Bankruptcy. We are going to look at the exact step-by-step sequence of events that occurs when a reigning superpower runs out of money. It is not a mystery. It is a meticulously documented historical blueprint.
Dalio maps out an archetypical 9-stage sequence of the final crisis, detailing the mechanical breakdown of how central governments and central banks fail. Let's walk through the critical transition stages. Stage 1 is the buildup. The private sector and the government both get deeply intoxicated by cheap debt and over-leverage themselves.
Which perfectly describes the decades leading up to the 2008 financial crisis.
Exactly. Then comes Stage 2. The private sector bubble bursts. Corporations and banks face imminent collapse. To prevent a depression, the government borrows massive amounts of money to bail them out, effectively transferring the toxic debt from the private sector onto the public balance sheet.
Okay, that makes sense.
But Stage 3 is where the existential threat begins. This is known as the squeeze. Eventually, the free market bond investors, pension funds, foreign nations, looked at the government's gargantuan debt pile and soaring inflation, and they refused to buy any more government bonds at low interest rates.
They act rationally. An investor says, I am not going to lend the U.S. government money for 10 years at a 2% interest rate when real inflation is running at 6%. That is a guaranteed mathematical loss.
Exactly. So the bond market stages a buyer's strike. The government suddenly can't fund its massive deficits through normal free market demand. That forces Stage 4. The central bank is forced to step in to monetize the debt.
They turn on the printers.
Yes. To prevent the government from defaulting on its obligations, the central bank prints trillions in new currency to buy the government's unwanted debt. But doing this floods the economy with money, which accelerates inflation, which in turn makes investors want to sell their existing bonds even faster.
It creates a vicious cycle, and this leads to what Dalio calls the ultimate big red flag. I love this concept because it is a tangible, measurable metric that anyone can look up.
The big red flag mathematically signals the endgame. It occurs when the central bank itself starts taking operating losses. You have to understand the mechanics here. To print money during QE, the central bank actually borrows reserves from commercial banks, and it pays those commercial banks an interest rate on those reserves.
Okay, tracking.
Now imagine the central bank bought trillions in government bonds yielding 2% during the bubble, but when inflation spikes, the central bank has to raise short-term interest rates to 5% to fight it.
Oh, wow.
Suddenly, the central bank is earning 2% on its assets, but it has to pay 5% to the commercial banks. It is instantly bleeding billions of dollars. The text explicitly notes the Federal Reserve currently has massive unrealized and operating losses for this exact reason. When a central bank operates at a loss, it is forced to print more money just to cover its own negative cash flow.
It is the ultimate death spiral. It's like the central bank becomes a snake eating its own tail. They print money to buy government debt, which inevitably causes inflation. To fight the inflation they just caused, they have to raise interest rates. But higher interest rates cause massive losses on the low-yielding debt they just bought, forcing them to print even more money just to cover the losses generated by their own policy. It is a self-destruct sequence baked into the math.
It is. And once that spiral begins, the only way out is what Dalio calls a beautiful deleveraging. It is an incredibly delicate, nearly impossible macroeconomic high-wire act. Policymakers must perfectly balance the pain.
Balance the pain.
Yes, they have to allow a certain amount of deflationary debt restructuring, meaning allowing bad businesses to fail and debts to be wiped out, while simultaneously executing just enough inflationary money printing to keep the system functioning. If they perfectly balance the inflation and the deflation, they can slowly bleed the real value of the debt burden out over a decade without completely destroying the social fabric.
But executing a beautiful deleveraging requires incredibly competent, bipartisan, visionary leadership, willing to make highly unpopular, painful choices for the long-term good, which, as we discussed in our breakdown of Stage 5, is usually the exact opposite of the polarized populist leadership a country has during this part of the cycle.
That is the tragic irony of the big cycle. The political environment required to fix the crisis is destroyed by the crisis itself. So if you want a reliable warning system, watch the central bank's balance sheet.
Right.
When a central bank becomes the only willing buyer of its own government's debt and it begins taking massive operating losses to sustain that buying, you are in the final stages of the cycle. At that point, the fundamental restructuring of the system is mathematically inevitable.
We've covered a massive amount of historical and economic ground today. We've decoded the mechanics of fiat money, the relentless 80-year debt cycles, the catastrophic doom loops, and the shifting tectonic plates of global geopolitical orders. But as we wrap this up, building on Dalio's foundational principle that human nature hasn't changed much over centuries, I want to leave everyone with a chilling thought that we haven't directly discussed yet. We spend so much time worrying about our investment portfolios and our bank accounts, but what if the real existential danger of the coming collapse isn't just the loss of purchasing power? History shows us that when populations are crushed by runaway inflation, crippling debt, and societal chaos, they become desperate. And a desperate population will eagerly, voluntarily hand over its democratic freedoms to any authoritarian leader who steps up to a podium and promises to make the economic pain stop. In the end, the ultimate casualty of the big debt cycle might not be the currency at all, it might be liberty itself.
It is a profound, terrifying, and historically accurate warning. The breakdown of the financial order almost always precedes the breakdown of the political and social order. Understanding these historical cycles isn't just an exercise in protecting your financial wealth, it is absolutely vital for protecting your society.
Thank you for watching. Please like, share, subscribe, follow up in next video.
Let's continue. Lesson 815.
Yeah, let's jump right back in.
So I want you to imagine waking up tomorrow morning, right? You check your bank account, and you see the exact same number you saw yesterday.
Sounds fine so far.
Right. But then you go to the grocery store, and literally every single price has doubled.
Oh, wow.
You go to pay your rent, and your landlord's like, hey, rent is up 50%. Your money hasn't actually vanished from your account, but its power, its ability to actually buy you the life you're used to, has just been completely gutted.
Right.
And not because of, a war or a hurricane, but simply because the invisible entity that prints your currency has quietly gone broke.
It really is, it's the ultimate silent crisis. Because we're so conditioned to look for, dramatic stuff, right?
Yeah, totally, like stock market crashes.
Exactly. A crash where everyone's screaming on the trading floor, or, a sudden run on a local bank where people are lined up around the block.
Like in the movies.
Right. But the structural earthquakes in a global economy, they happen really slowly. Yeah.
They happen on the balance sheets of central banks long before you or I ever feel the tremors.
And that is exactly what we are dissecting today in this deep dive. We're exploring this sweeping historical and economic framework, pulling heavily from Ray Dalio's research, research into, how empires rise and fall, the hidden architecture of these massive debt cycles, and, well, what it all means for your collective future as a listener.
It's a huge topic.
It is. We're basically trying to translate this massive, frankly, kind of intimidating source material into a roadmap for you.
Yeah, but to even read that roadmap, we kind of have to understand the terrain first. What is actually driving these cycles?
Okay, let's unpack this. What are the driving forces here?
Well, you have to look at what Dalio defines as the overall big cycle.
Right.
And it's this incredibly powerful framework because it refuses to look at economics in, a vacuum.
Makes sense. It posits that the rise and fall of empires are driven by 5 major, totally interwoven forces. I like to think of them as 5 massive gears inside a global clock.
Okay, 5 years.
Yeah, and if one gear slips, it grinds against all the others.
So what exactly are the 5 gears?
Well, gear number 1 is the debt, money, and economic cycle.
Okay, so just the math of credit and borrowing, basically.
Exactly, just the pure math. Then in gear number 2 is the internal political order.
Meaning, wait, how well a country gets along with itself.
Exactly that. It measures the level of harmony or, intense polarization within a specific country.
Got it.
Then gear number 3 is the external geopolitical order. So how do these massive nation states compete, cooperate, or go to war with one another?
Right, the global stage. What about 4?
Gear number 4 covers acts of nature.
Like climate stuff.
Yeah, historically this includes massive droughts, floods, and of course pandemics that just totally disrupt economies.
Right, which we know a lot about recently.
Yeah, we certainly do. And finally, gear number 5 is human inventiveness or, technology.
So let me get this straight. If you're trying to figure out where we are in the cycle, you can't just pull up a chart on inflation and call it a day.
No, not at all.
You have to look at inflation, plus the political anger, plus international trade wars, plus a global pandemic, plus, the rise of AI.
Exactly. It's all one giant machine.
That's a lot to keep track of.
It is. And right now, all 5 of those gears are under immense, unprecedented stress, which actually brings us to the first major mechanical failure that signals the end of a cycle.
Lesson 8, the central bank death spiral.
Yeah.
So here's the scenario that genuinely just breaks my brain.
Okay, lay it on me.
We always hear about governments going broke, right?
Yeah.
Or corporations going bankrupt.
Sure.
But what actually happens when the central bank, the entity that literally has a monopoly on printing the money, goes broke?
It's such a brilliant question because going broke for a central bank is just fundamentally different from, say, a normal business going broke.
Right, because they own the printer.
Exactly. If a restaurant goes broke, they run out of cash, they literally can't pay their suppliers, the doors get locked, and everyone just goes home.
Game over.
Right. But a central bank doesn't default in that traditional sense. They physically can't run out of money because they're the sole creators of the money.
So what do they do instead?
Instead, they enter what is mathematically a self-reinforcing doom loop.
A doom loop. Wow. How does a doom loop like that even start? Like, walk me through the mechanics of that.
Okay, so it all begins in the bond market.
Okay.
Let's say a government is running massive deficits. I mean, they're spending way, way more than they take in through taxes.
Which sounds pretty familiar.
Right, yeah. So to cover that massive gap, they issue government debt. Bonds.
Just IOUs.
Exactly. And usually private investors, foreign governments, pension funds, they all buy those bonds because, well, they're considered super safe and they pay a decent interest rate.
Right, it's a safe place to park your cash.
Usually, yeah. But eventually, the government's debt gets so incredibly massive and the inflation rate starts climbing so high that the free market demand for those bonds just vanishes.
Wait, why does it vanish?
Because the investors look at the bonds and they do the math. They say, look, the interest you're paying me is actually less than the current rate of inflation. I am mathematically guaranteed to lose purchasing power if I buy this. I'm out.
Oh, wow. So the government is basically throwing a bond auction, and nobody shows up to buy.
Crickets, yeah.
But the government still has to, pay the military, fund Medicare, keep the lights on in Washington.
Mm-hmm.
So who actually buys the debt when no one else will?
The buyer of last resort. The central bank?
Central bank itself.
Yeah. They step in and buy all that unwanted government debt. This is what economists call monetizing the debt.
Monetizing the debt. Meaning what exactly?
They are essentially inventing money out of thin air to buy their own government's IOUs.
I mean, it sounds like a neat little magic trick.
It does, right.
Yeah. But where is the trap? There has to be a trap.
Oh, there is. The trap lies entirely in how they pay for it.
Yeah.
When the central bank buys those long-term government bonds, they don't just print physical paper bills and hand them over in a briefcase.
Right.
They create digital reserves. They essentially borrow money from the commercial banking system, and they actually have to pay those commercial banks a short-term interest rate on those reserves.
Okay, wait, let me make sure I'm following you. So they hold long-term government bonds that pay them interest.
Yes.
But they owe short-term interest to the commercial banks.
Right. You've got it.
Okay.
Now imagine inflation suddenly spikes.
Which we've definitely seen.
Exactly. The central bank, to fight that inflation, has to raise short-term interest rates, right? That's their main tool.
Right, to cool the economy down.
But suddenly, because they raise rates, the interest rate they are paying to the commercial banks on those massive reserves just skyrockets.
Oh.
Yeah. But the interest they are earning on those old, long-term government bonds they bought years ago, that stays exactly the same at a very low fixed rate.
Oh, wow. So almost overnight, the central bank is actually paying out more in interest than it's taking in.
Precisely.
Wait, so they are bleeding cash.
Yeah.
The entity that literally prints the money is cash flow negative.
Severely cash flow negative. In banking terms, they suffer massive mark-to-market losses.
Right.
Meaning if you looked at a central bank in this situation like a normal everyday business, their net worth would be deeply alarmingly negative.
But they can't declare bankruptcy.
Yeah.
Right. So how on earth do they pay that interest to the commercial banks if they're actively losing money?
Well, they only have one option. They have to fire up the printer again.
You're kidding.
Nope. They're forced to print money simply to cover their own internal operating losses.
That is insane. Wait, so it's like a business taking out a high-interest payday loan just to pay the mortgage on this, crumbling rental property that brings in almost no rent.
That is a brutally accurate analogy, yeah.
So for you as a listener, managing your own wealth, the step action here, the indicator you really need to watch, is the central bank's net worth.
Exactly.
Because when it turns significantly negative and they are printing money just to cover their own massive losses, a death spiral has officially begun.
And you can really see why it's a
Let's
spiral.
break it down.
The central bank prints money to cover its own losses.
Right.
But that extra money printing inherently devalues the currency even further.
Makes sense. More supply, less value.
Exactly. So then private investors see the currency dropping, so they aggressively sell off whatever government debt they still hold.
Because they're panicking.
Right. And that massive sell-off pushes bond prices down and interest rates even higher, which then crushes the value of the bonds the central bank is holding even further.
Which pushes them deeper into the red.
Exactly, which forces them to print even more money to buy up the newly dumped debt. It's a vicious cycle.
You know, the source material actually notes an absolutely wild illustrative fact about this.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. If the U.S. Federal Reserve's bonds were marked to market today, meaning if they had to value them at what they could actually sell them for right this second, they would be sitting on losses of around $700 billion.
It's staggering.
It's like 2.5% of the entire U.S. GDP just sitting there as a loss on the central bank's balance sheet.
It is an almost incomprehensible amount of unrealized loss. Now, to be fair, they don't have to recognize that loss immediately.
Because they don't have to sell them.
Right. They can just hold the bonds to maturity. But the negative cash flow, the fact that they are physically paying more to banks every day than they are earning, is a real daily bleed.
But how long can they keep that up before the currency just collapses?
Yeah.
Like, if they control the printer, can they really just do this forever?
I mean, they can sustain it much, much longer than a private business, certainly.
Because no one can foreclose on them.
Right. But they cannot suspend the laws of economic gravity forever. Eventually, printing money to cover your own losses while simultaneously monetizing your government's debt, it destroys trust.
And trust is kind of the whole game.
Trust is literally the only thing holding a fiat currency together.
Right.
So when that trust breaks, it leads to a critical massive panic, which triggers the next phase of the crisis.
Lesson 9, the run on the bank and money printing.
Yeah.
And this directly answers something that has baffled me for a really long time.
What's that?
Okay, when a country gets into massive debt trouble, why do governments historically always choose to devalue your money? Like, why not just tighten their belts, enforce some austerity, balance the budget, and, take the pain like a responsible household would?
Well, to understand why governments basically never choose austerity in the end, you have to look at the underlying math of the credit system itself.
Okay.
You really have to internalize this one core insight. A debt is not actual money.
Wait, what do you mean?
A debt is simply a legal promise to deliver money in the future.
Okay, a promise to pay. I'm with you.
Right. And during a long-term economic expansion, when times are good, banks and financial institutions create vastly more promises to deliver money than there is actual physical hard cash in existence.
Ah, the fractional reserve system.
Exactly.
Oh.
For every $1 of actual base money sitting in a vault somewhere, there might be $10 or $20 of credit promises floating around the broader economy.
It's a massive game of musical chairs.
It is the ultimate game of musical chairs. When the economy is booming, the music is playing, and everyone feels rich because they're just trading these promises back and forth, right?
Sure.
But during a severe debt crisis, the music stops.
And there aren't enough chairs.
Nowhere near enough. Suddenly, people start worrying about whether those promises will actually be kept, so they rush to convert their debt assets, their bonds, their bank deposits, all their promises into hard cash or tangible assets.
Right.
And this is what we historically call a run on the bank.
And when everyone demands their cash at the exact same time.
There simply isn't enough cash in the vault.
Wow.
There never is. The promises far exceed the actual money. So the central bank and the government are forced into a corner, and they have two terrifying choices.
Okay, what's choice A?
Choice A is to keep the money supply tight and absolutely refuse to print.
And what happens if they choose choice A?
You get a full-blown deflationary depression.
Oof.
Yeah. Because there isn't enough money to fulfill all the promises, massive waves of defaults sweep through the economy.
People go bankrupt.
Banks collapse, businesses go bankrupt because all the credit just freezes up overnight. Unemployment skyrockets to like 20 or 30%. Asset prices for homes and stocks absolutely crash.
It's just total devastation.
It is sheer, brutal economic misery because all those paper promises are being violently destroyed. That is exactly the pain of the 1930s Great Depression.
Okay, so that sounds awful. So what is choice B?
Choice B is to fire up the printing press.
Just print the difference?
Yeah. The central bank creates new money out of thin air and injects it straight into the system to ease the pain. They give the debtors cash to pay their debts, they bail out the struggling banks, and in doing so, they drastically increase the supply of money.
Which obviously devalues the currency.
Exactly. And historically, without exception, when faced with this binary choice between a depression or inflation, central banks always choose choice B. They print and they devalue.
So they essentially sacrifice the currency to save the overall system.
Yes.
But why is it so inevitable? Like, why never choice A?
Because the political and social pain of a deflationary depression is simply too high for any leader to stomach.
That makes sense.
I mean, a wave of bankruptcies and 25% unemployment, that's an acute, in-your-face, immediate crisis that will get politicians voted out of office immediately.
Or, in some historical cases, literally dragged out of their palaces.
Exactly. Inflation, on the other hand, is a hidden tax.
It transfers wealth from the creditors and the everyday savers directly to the debtors and the government, but it does it slowly.
Yes. It's stealthy. If the government owes $1 trillion and they just print $1 trillion to pay it off, they haven't technically defaulted, right?
Technically, no.
But the person who receives those newly printed dollars goes to the store and finds out they can only buy half as many groceries.
Right. It's the path of least immediate political resistance.
Always.
So if you are trying to read the tea leaves on when this is about to happen to a specific country's currency, what is the step action? What's the indicator?
You watch their foreign reserves.
Okay, so when you see a central bank spending massive amounts of its foreign reserves like US dollars or gold to actively defend their currency's value on the open market, you need to prepare for a sudden devaluation.
Yeah, and the text notes they often blow through, like 49% of their total reserves in just a 6-month window.
Which is insane. They fight the market, they spend all their reserves, and then they just wake up one morning and give up.
They have to give up because, honestly, you can't outspend the global market. And when they finally give up, they transition into this fascinating mechanical dynamic that economists from the 1930s described as pushing on a string.
Pushing on a string, how does that work?
Okay, think about a normal recession.
Sure.
The central bank wants to stimulate the economy, so they lower interest rates, right?
Yeah, that makes borrowing cheaper.
Exactly. It's like pulling a string. It guides you to take out a mortgage, buy a new car, start a small business. The economy speeds back up.
Okay.
But late in a long-term debt cycle, debts are already so incredibly high, and people are so economically scarred from the crisis that even if the central bank drops interest rates all the way down to zero, nobody wants to borrow.
Right. I mean, if I'm already drowning in debt, I don't care if a new loan is at 0%. I'm terrified. I'm hoarding whatever cash I have left.
Exactly. So the central bank tries to push credit into the economy, but it just crumples. You can pull a string, but you can't push it.
I get it now. Lowering rates doesn't stimulate the economy anymore because the string just folds.
Yes, and that forces them to invent radical new tools.
Because their traditional lever is completely broken.
Totally broken. So they have to bypass the traditional interest rate level entirely. Instead of just encouraging private banks to lend, the central bank resorts to directly buying up government debt and sometimes even private corporate debt themselves.
But they just brute force it.
Yeah, they just inject cash directly into the system by purchasing assets. We've seen historical runs on central banks where they tried to defend the currency, depleted their reserves, failed, and then the currency plummeted while the base money, what we call M0, absolutely ballooned as they printed to buy assets.
Here's where it gets really interesting. I sort of picture it like a pressure cooker.
Okay, pressure cooker.
Yeah, you have all this debt building up immense pressure inside. You either let the pressure blow the lid completely off, which is the wave of bankruptcies, the deflationary depression, the broken promises, or you slowly bleed the steam out by printing money.
Right.
Which slowly cooks everyone's savings through inflation. It really is a choice between a sudden explosion and a slow boil.
Right.
Why is the slow boil always the preferred choice?
Like we established, human nature and sheer political survival dictate that leaders will always choose the slow boil over the explosion.
Yeah, nobody wants the explosion on their watch.
Exactly. And to truly grasp how we arrived at a global financial system where central banks actually have the infinite power to just bleed the steam out and print money endlessly, we have to look backward.
Back in time.
Yes. We have to look at the system that was created from scratch after the last time the global pressure cooker actually did explode.
Lesson 10, Part 3. Looking back at the post-1945 world, we live in a world right now where the U.S. dollar is, frankly, Like the sun in the center of the economic solar system, right?
It absolutely is.
Every other currency, every commodity, every barrel of oil revolves around it. But how did the U.S. dollar actually secure that absolute central position?
To really understand the modern dollar, you have to travel back to the summer of 1944.
Okay, 1944.
To a hotel in Bretton Woods, New Hampshire. World War II was finally coming to an end, and the victorious Allied powers gathered to design a brand new global economic order.
Because the old one was completely destroyed.
Exactly. They needed to rebuild a devastated world, and they knew they needed a stable monetary system to do it, so they created what Dalio categorizes as a monetary policy zero system, or MP0.
MP0, and what defines that exactly?
MP0 is a hard money system.
Hard money.
It means the currency is intrinsically linked to a physical commodity. At Bretton Woods, they all agreed that the U.S. dollar would be tied directly to physical gold at a fixed, completely unchangeable price of $35 an ounce.
Okay.
And crucially, almost every other major global currency was then pegged directly to the U.S. dollar.
Okay, but wait. Why the U.S. dollar, though?
What do you mean?
Well, if they were designing a totally new world order, why not the British pound? Britain still had a massive empire. Or, I don't know, the French franc.
It all came down to one thing. Who held the gold? At the end of World War II, Europe and Asia were just physically devastated and financially bankrupt.
Right. Their infrastructure was rubble.
The United States, on the other hand, had suffered basically no domestic infrastructure damage. Their manufacturing base was absolutely roaring. And most importantly, they had accumulated roughly 2/3 of the entire world's sovereign gold reserves.
2/3?
Yeah, because they had been selling supplies to the Allies for years and demanding payment in physical gold.
Oh, wow. So they were the ultimate creditor nation. They had all the money, all the gold, and all the intact factories. They were just the undisputed global superpower.
Exactly. And when you have 2/3 of the world's gold, you get to make the rules.
Fair enough.
The rule was the dollar is as good as gold. And the whole world trusted it because the U.S. actually had the physical metal sitting in the vaults to back it up.
Now, a key pattern the source material emphasizes here is that periods following major global conflicts, like this post-1945 era, usually spark immense productivity, peace, and prosperity.
They do.
People are just exhausted from fighting. They just want to build families and businesses. But ironically, that exact same period of immense peace and prosperity plants the seeds of the next massive debt bubble. So that's the step action here. Recognize that cycle.
It is a profoundly predictable human pattern, yeah. In the post-war years, the 1950s, we saw incredible technological leaps, massive infrastructure projects, and a booming middle class.
Right.
But we also saw the painful changing of the geopolitical guard.
Gear number 3 turning, right? The external geopolitical order.
Yes. The United Kingdom, which had previously held the dominant global reserve currency status for over a century, rapidly lost it.
Slipped away.
And this transition wasn't just economic, it was military and political too. It was highlighted really starkly by the 1956 Suez Canal crisis.
What happened?
Britain, France, and Israel tried to seize the canal, but the U.S. and the Soviet Union basically stepped in and forced them to back down.
Wow, just told them no.
Yeah, it proved undeniably that Britain could no longer project imperial power on its own. And the financial reality caught up a decade later with the incredibly humiliating 1967 devaluation of the British pound. The torch had officially been passed to the U.S.
Meanwhile, the U.S. economy is just an absolute juggernaut.
Yeah.
But then, as the cycle predicts, they get comfortable and they start making a classic empire mistake.
Yeah.
By the 1960s, the U.S. starts over-borrowing.
The infamous guns and butter era.
Guns and butter, right.
President Lyndon B. Johnson wanted to fund the massive escalation of the Vietnam War abroad. That's the guns.
Right.
While simultaneously funding the expansive Great Society and War on Poverty social programs at home. That's the butter.
And I'm guessing they didn't want to raise taxes high enough to actually pay for both.
Politicians rarely do.
Yeah, true.
So, to pay for both the war and the social programs, the U.S. government and the Federal Reserve started subtly, quietly expanding the money supply. They were creating far more paper claims on gold, meaning printing paper dollars, than they actually had physical gold sitting in the vault at Fort Knox to back them up.
Wait. But if the whole global system was built on the rock-solid promise that 1 ounce of gold is $35, and the U.S. is printing way more dollars than they have gold, Wasn't the U.S. basically running a geopolitical Ponzi scheme?
That is exactly what they were doing.
Like, what happens when the rest of the world realizes the vault is half empty and they actually show up at the bank demanding their gold?
Well, that is the literal definition of a hard money debt crisis.
Okay.
And the rest of the world wasn't blind to this. Countries like France, led by Charles de Gaulle, they did the math.
They saw the inflation.
Exactly. They looked at the U.S. inflation rate, they looked at the massive Vietnam War spending, and they realized the U.S. was writing checks it absolutely couldn't cash. So, France and others literally started sending battleships across the Atlantic, handing the U.S. Treasury piles of paper dollars, and demanding the physical gold in return.
Because that was their right under the Bretton Woods Agreement.
It was their right.
So they called the bluff.
They absolutely did. And the U.S. gold reserves started plummeting at an alarming rate. It became a classic run on the bank, but on a sovereign global scale.
Wow.
The U.S. was hemorrhaging its most precious financial asset.
And that exact terrifying scenario came to a head in the late summer of 1971, a moment that permanently, radically altered the very definition of money itself.
It really did.
Lesson 11, the fiat money trap. What happened after 1971? We talk a lot about August 1971 in finance circles. What exactly happened on that Sunday night that changed how every single person's savings work today?
Okay, so it was August 15, 1971. President Richard Nixon had spent a highly secretive weekend at Camp David with his top economic advisors.
Because they were panicking.
Total panic. The U.S. was days away from outright defaulting on its gold obligations. If they kept handing out gold to France and everyone else, they would have literally run out.
So what did they do?
Nixon went on national television on a Sunday night, interrupting popular programming, and just shocked the entire global financial system. He announced that he was temporarily, quote-unquote, suspending the convertibility of the dollar into gold.
He closed the gold window.
He severed the umbilical cord between the paper dollar and physical gold. In that one television broadcast, he officially transitioned the entire world from MP0, a hard money system, into MP1.
And MP1 is?
MP1 is a fiat money system driven entirely by interest rates.
Okay, just to clarify for everyone, fiat money means money by decree, right?
Yes.
Like it has value, not because it could be traded for an ounce of gold, but simply because the U.S. government says it has value, and crucially, demands that you pay your taxes in it.
Exactly. The intrinsic value is zero. The value is derived completely from trust and government enforcement. And it's really crucial to understand that while Nixon's move shocked the world, it wasn't actually unprecedented.
It wasn't?
No. He was running the exact same historical playbook that President Franklin D. Roosevelt ran in 1933.
Oh, right.
Yeah. During the Great Depression, FDR defaulted on the domestic gold standard. There were way more domestic claims for gold than actual gold, so FDR simply broke the promise to deliver the gold, literally making it illegal for U.S. citizens to hoard it.
That is wild.
Nixon just did the exact same thing, but on an international scale.
So if you're a listener trying to protect your wealth over the course of a lifetime, this is your step action.
Yeah.
You absolutely have to understand these distinct phases of central bank policy.
You have to know which rule book the central bank is currently using.
Right. So you mentioned MP1. That's the interest rate manipulation phase.
Yes.
Then there's MP2, which is quantitative easing or debt monetization, which started around 2008.
Correct.
And finally, there's MP3, which is coordinated fiscal deficits and money printing, which kicked off during the pandemic in 2020.
That's the progression, yeah.
Can we walk through how these decades actually felt for regular people living under this new fiat system? Like, what did it feel like on the ground?
Let's trace the arc. The 1970s, immediately following Nixon's announcement, were chaotic and highly, highly inflationary.
Right, because the anchor was gone.
Because the dollar was no longer tied to gold, the central bank could and did print a lot of money. The value of the dollar plummeted. Oil prices absolutely skyrocketed. Real interest rates, meaning the interest rate minus inflation, were often negative.
So if you had money sitting in a savings account, you were basically getting robbed by inflation every year.
It was a terrible decade for creditors and savers, but interestingly, it was an amazing time for debtors.
Really? How so?
Think about it. If you had a fixed-rate mortgage on your house, you were paying back that massive loan with dollars that were suddenly worth much, much less. Inflation was literally eating your debt for you.
Oh, right. But, I mean, inflation that high destroys a society eventually. People can't afford to buy food, so the pendulum has to swing back, right? We hit the 1980s.
Right. By the late 1970s, inflation was a massive existential political crisis. To kill it, The Federal Reserve, under Chairman Paul Volcker, took drastic action.
The famous Volcker shock.
Yeah, he cranked the federal funds interest rate up to nearly 20%.
20%? That is unimaginable today.
It is. He intentionally induced a brutal recession just to break the back of inflation.
He slammed on the brakes.
Hard. So the 1980s became an era of incredibly tight money and high real interest rates. If you were a saver, it was fantastic. You could get a risk-free return of over 10% on your money in the bank.
Wow.
But it was absolutely crushing for debtors. This tight money policy triggered a massive debt crisis in emerging markets, particularly in Latin America.
Because they had borrowed in dollars.
Exactly. They had borrowed heavily in U.S. dollars during the loose 70s. Suddenly, their debt payments doubled or tripled overnight, and multiple countries just defaulted.
Okay, so they squeeze the system, they kill inflation, and that sets the stage for the massive debt-financed tech bubble of the 1990s.
Right.
The internet arrives, productivity spikes, everyone goes completely crazy for dot-com stocks, and then it crashes in 2000.
Yeah.
But the really structural shift happens in 2008, doesn't it?
Yeah, 2008 changed everything. The global housing and debt bubble burst spectacularly. The entire financial system was seizing up. So the Federal Reserve aggressively used their MP1 tool. They slashed interest rates.
They cut them to the bone.
They dropped them from over 5% all the way down to 0.
But it wasn't enough.
It wasn't enough. Interest rates hit 0, and they couldn't realistically go lower without causing massive banking malfunctions.
Because you can't have negative interest rates without things getting weird.
Right. The traditional MP1 tool was completely broken. So faced with that deflationary depression we talked about earlier, central banks invented MP2. Quantitative easing.
Quantitative easing.
Mm-hmm.
How exactly does that differ from just lowering interest rates, like practically speaking?
Instead of just making borrowing cheaper, the central bank starts creating billions of new digital dollars and uses them to buy assets directly from the open market.
What kind of assets?
Mostly long-term government bonds and mortgage-backed securities from the large banks. They act as the massive buyer of last resort to pump cash directly into the banking system, hoping the banks will lend it out and keep the economy from collapsing.
And this pumped up the stock market for a solid decade.
It definitely did.
But then we hit 2020, the pandemic hits, and it shuts down the entire global economy overnight.
And this is exactly where we enter MP3.
The final phase.
Yeah. See, in 2008, the central bank gave money to the banks, hoping it would trickle down to the people. In 2020, they realized that wasn't fast enough. The crisis was too acute. So they coordinated directly with the federal government.
MP3 is when the traditional boundaries between the Treasury Department and the central bank completely dissolve.
Yeah. Yes. They merge. The government decides to run multi-trillion-dollar deficits to send direct stimulus checks to citizens, bail out airlines, fund forgivable PPP loans for businesses.
It's just raining money from helicopters.
Exactly. And the central bank simultaneously creates trillions of new dollars to buy all the debt the government is issuing to fund those programs. They work perfectly in tandem.
You know, there's a fascinating paradox in the source material about that weekend in 1971 that makes perfect sense when you understand MP2 and MP3.
What's that?
Well, when Nixon defaulted on the gold promise, effectively telling the entire world that the United States was broke in gold terms, you would logically assume the stock market would crash in a total panic on Monday morning, right?
I think so.
But it didn't. The stock market actually rallied over 3% the very next day.
Because investors are smart. It rallied because investors realized that without the gold constraint, the government could now print infinite money.
Right.
And when you print money, it eventually flows into assets. It pumps up the stock market, it pumps up real estate.
But it creates an illusion.
A profound illusion of wealth. You look at your investment account, and the numbers are going up. You feel richer.
Yeah.
But if you measure those assets against the cost of a house, or healthcare, or food, you realize the actual purchasing power of those numbers is steadily declining. The yardstick itself is shrinking.
So what does this all mean? Let me try an analogy to see if I have the mechanics of these three phases right.
Go for it.
If MP1 is like driving a car using the normal gas and brake pedals, you know, you tweak interest rates up and down to control the speed of the economy.
Yep.
And MP2 is like hitting a nitrous boost button. Quantitative easing, injecting cash straight into the engine when the gas pedal isn't enough.
Oh, okay.
Is MP3 basically tearing out the car engine entirely, replacing it with a massive experimental rocket ship engine, and having the politicians and the central bank actively try to steer it together while flying at supersonic speeds?
I love that. That is a highly illustrative way to look at it. In MP3, the amount of money being injected is astronomical. And it goes directly into the real economy, not just the banking sector. You are flying a rocket ship of newly created money.
Sounds dangerous.
It is. The inherent risk of a rocket ship is that it is incredibly difficult to steer, it burns through fuel at a terrifying rate, and it is highly prone to explosive inflation if the coordination between the government and the central bank falters even slightly.
And while the United States was busy navigating these wild fiat money cycles, moving from the gas pedal to the nitrous boost to the rocket ship, another superpower across the globe was quietly executing the most rapid, staggering economic ascent in human history.
They certainly were.
This brings us to Lesson 12, the rise of China and the new global rivalry.
Right.
Now, before we dive into the mechanics of this, it is crucial that we establish a boundary here.
Absolutely.
The following discussion touches on highly polarized geopolitical environments and deeply contrasting political systems. We are strictly remaining neutral. We're not taking sides between the U.S. or Chinese systems or debating the morality of capitalism versus communism. Our goal is strictly to report Ray Dalio's historical framework directly from the source material to understand the mechanics of rising and falling empires.
And that neutrality is essential for this kind of macroeconomic analysis. If you inject moral judgment, you blind yourself to the actual mechanical forces at play. We are just observing the gears of the clock.
Absolutely. So, with that said, how exactly did a nation go from enduring what historians call a century of humiliation to rivaling the United States in just a few short decades?
Well, the speed and scale of the transformation are truly historically unprecedented. Following the brutal Chinese Civil War, which ended in 1949 with the establishment of the People's Republic, China went through a long period of extreme isolation, internal turmoil, and severe economic hardship.
They were effectively disconnected from the global economy.
Right, completely disconnected.
But then a massive pivot happens.
The pivotal moment came in 1978 under the leadership of Deng Xiaoping. He initiated the open door and reform policies.
Okay, what did that entail?
He essentially recognized that to build national strength, they needed to integrate with the global market. This unleashed a massive wave of state-directed, capitalism-infused growth.
They basically became the factory of the world.
Exactly. They invited in foreign capital, foreign technology, and foreign manufacturing expertise, and paired it with a massive, highly disciplined, and inexpensive domestic labor force.
The perfect storm for growth.
The productivity explosion was unimaginable. They literally lifted hundreds of millions of people out of extreme poverty in a single generation.
But when you are analyzing global power shifts, you have to look beyond just the GDP numbers and the manufacturing output. The framework warns us, and this is a key step action, to look out for the Thucydides trap. What is that?
The Thucydides trap is a historical concept named after the ancient Greek historian who chronicled the Peloponnesian War. The core principle is that there is inevitable, often dangerous friction when a rapidly rising power threatens to displace an established ruling power. Thucydides noted that it was the rise of Athens and the fear that this instilled in Sparta that made war inevitable.
I see.
And over the last 500 years, this dynamic has played out repeatedly, like a rising Germany challenging the British Empire leading up to World War I.
So if you synthesize China's progress through Dalio's big cycle, they're finding the classical archetype of a rising empire almost perfectly.
Mechanically, yes. They started in extreme poverty and internal conflict. Through hard work, intense education, and economic reform, they became highly productive and captured a massive share of global trade.
Right.
As they generated immense wealth from exporting goods, they built massive internal capital markets, modernized their military, and expanded their geopolitical influence.
But, as always happens in the big cycle, that incredible economic success eventually breeds a massive internal debt bubble. Like real estate speculation runs rampant.
That is the gear of the debt cycle turning. And now, under President Xi Jinping, China is entering a new, distinct phase.
How so?
They recognize the danger of their internal debt bubble, particularly in real estate, and they are dealing with it by returning to a much more top-down, state-controlled approach. They are emphasizing common prosperity, tightening regulations on their tech billionaires, and focusing on internal stability.
Right.
And they are doing all of this while simultaneously engaging in a classic multi-front great power conflict with the established power, the United States.
The source material extrapolates on this conflict by comparing the deep philosophical approaches to leadership in both countries. And it's fascinating because it explains why compromise is so incredibly difficult.
It really does.
It points out that China's approach to governance is deeply influenced by thousands of years of Confucianism.
Right. Confucianism places a heavy focus on societal harmony, strict respect for hierarchy, and the belief that the collective good must be overseen by a strong, paternalistic leader or party. The family, and by extension the state, is paramount.
Which is fundamentally radically different from the operating system of Western capitalism.
Total opposite. The West, and particularly the U.S., is deeply rooted in individualism, a massive distrust of centralized power, bottom-up democratic processes, and the belief that self-interest ultimately drives the best outcomes.
These aren't just minor political disagreements, then. They're entirely different philosophical operating systems.
Right. It explains why they constantly talk past each other. They aren't just fighting over trade deficits, they're clashing over the fundamental definition of how a human society should be organized.
And this conflict is playing out across multiple intense battlegrounds. I mean, there's the economic trade war with tariffs, there is the intense, terrifying geopolitical friction over the status of Taiwan, and perhaps most critically for the future, the race for total technological and military supremacy.
The technological race is arguably the most vital because whichever nation controls the next wave of AI, quantum computing, and advanced semiconductors will likely have the economic and military leverage to dictate the global order for the next century.
But here is the problem that neither side seems to be able to easily solve. The U.S. and China have been locked in this incredibly tight economic marriage for 40 years.
Very codependent marriage.
Exactly. China manufactures the goods, the U.S. buys those goods, and China takes the dollars they earn and loans them back to the U.S. by buying treasury bonds so the U.S. can afford to keep buying.
Right.
If you are in a great power conflict, how do you uncouple that deeply intertwined economic marriage without both economies going through a financially devastating divorce?
A devastating divorce is a very real risk, and we are actually already seeing the initial stages of it. It's called decoupling or nearshoring.
Moving supply chains away.
Yes. The U.S. is putting massive tariffs on Chinese goods, implementing strict embargoes on advanced semiconductor technology, and trying to rebuild domestic manufacturing.
But that decoupling is incredibly expensive, isn't it?
Extremely expensive. For 40 years, the global economy prioritized pure economic efficiency, finding the absolute cheapest place on earth to build a product.
Right, which kept inflation low.
Exactly. But now, governments are prioritizing national security and supply chain resilience over efficiency. When you actively sacrifice efficiency, you inherently drive up the cost of goods, which fuels inflation, and you drive up national debt to subsidize new local factories.
So it forces both nations to endure significant, sustained economic pain to slowly untangle themselves.
Yes, it's a very painful process.
And before we look at how the U.S. might handle its own massive debt bubble while fighting this great power conflict, we actually have a chilling, real-world case study of what happens when a massive, technologically advanced empire's debt bubble bursts and isn't handled correctly.
We do indeed.
Lesson 13, Japan's lost decades, a warning to the world.
This is a crucial lesson.
I think a lot of people assume that if a country is wealthy, highly educated, and at the absolute cutting edge of technology, they're immune to economic collapse. Like, can a country like that really just economically stagnate for 30 straight years?
The short, sobering answer is yes. Yes, they can. Japan is the ultimate cautionary tale for the developed world right now. After rebuilding from the total devastation of World War II, Japan experienced an economic miracle that basically mirrored China's later rise.
Right.
By the 1980s, Japanese manufacturing was dominating the globe. They were buying up prime real estate in New York City. Their electronics were everywhere.
I remember that, the 80s boom.
But underneath that incredible boom, they had inflated one of the largest, most extreme debt and real estate asset bubbles in human history.
And in 1989, the clock struck midnight.
In 1989 and 1990, the bubble finally popped, the stock market crashed, and real estate values absolutely cratered.
Now, a bubble bursting is a normal part of the cycle, right?
Right.
But Japan's reaction to the burst is what made it a multi-decade tragedy, didn't it?
Yes. They comprehensively failed to execute what Dalio calls a beautiful deleveraging.
Okay, what does a beautiful deleveraging actually look like in practice?
In a beautiful deleveraging, policymakers have to do two very painful things simultaneously. First, they have to force the system to aggressively restructure and write down the bad debts.
Take the medicine.
Exactly. They have to let the bankrupt banks and failed businesses collapse quickly to clear the rot out of the system.
Which hurts.
It hurts a lot. So second, they have to simultaneously print enough money to cushion the blow and prevent a total deflationary spiral.
Okay.
Japan didn't do either of those things fast enough or aggressively enough.
Why didn't they?
Culturally and politically, they prioritized social stability and avoiding short-term pain over long-term economic dynamism. They refused to force their major banks to realize the massive losses on their bad real estate loans.
Oh, they just hid them.
Yes. Instead, the banks just rolled the bad loans over, effectively hiding the losses on their balance sheets.
And this creates what economists call zombie companies.
Exactly. A zombie company is a business that is fundamentally unviable. It barely generates enough revenue to pay the interest on its massive debts, let alone pay down the principal or invest in research and development.
So it's just Walking Dead.
Right. And because the banks kept lending them money just to keep them on life support, capital was trapped. It couldn't flow to new, innovative startups. The entire economy was essentially frozen in amber, carrying the dead weight of the 1980s bubble.
And simultaneously, the central bank didn't print money aggressively enough early on to offset the deflation.
Right. They were too slow on both fronts.
So decades of grinding stagnation followed. Asset prices never recovered. Growth basically flatlined. It wasn't until much later that they tried a radical new experiment, right?
Right. Finally, in late 2012 and early 2013, Prime Minister Shinzo Abe and the Bank of Japan Governor Haruhiko Kuroda decided they had to break the deflationary mindset once and for all.
Enter Abenomics.
They implemented a massive aggressive policy known as the three arrows, or Abenomics, and the most critical arrow was massive debt monetization.
They finally slammed on the MP2 button.
They hit it harder than almost anyone else in history. The Bank of Japan printed astronomical amounts of yen to buy government bonds, effectively capping interest rates near zero, and even went as far as buying stock market ETFs directly.
They were just buying everything. Did it work?
It did finally stop the deflationary spiral. The stock market went up, but it came with a devastating hidden cost.
Which was?
Because the central bank bought so much debt and kept interest rates artificially pinned at zero, while the rest of the world eventually started raising rates, the Japanese yen collapsed in value on the foreign exchange markets.
The numbers in the source material regarding this wealth destruction are absolutely staggering for Japanese investors.
Repeatedly are.
Since 2013, Japanese government bonds, which are considered the safest asset in their country, have lost 45% of their value relative to U.S. bonds and 60% of their value relative to physical gold.
It's a massive destruction of wealth.
But the most tragic part is what it did to the everyday citizen. The average Japanese worker's wages have been totally flat in nominal yen for nearly 25 years. But because the yen lost so much global purchasing power against the dollar and commodities, their equivalent global income dropped from about $3,500 a month down to $2,500 a month.
It's steadily getting poorer.
So Japan basically chose a 30-year economic deep freeze to avoid a painful surgery in the 90s. But now that they are printing unlimited money to artificially thaw themselves out, isn't their currency just melting away in the process?
That is the exact brutal trade-off of the fiat system. They successfully avoided the acute, chaotic pain of a massive wave of bankruptcies and double-digit unemployment in the 1990s. They maintained social cohesion.
Which is important to them.
Very. But the ultimate cost was a slow, multi-decade erosion of their national wealth and their global purchasing power. The ice is melting, and it is taking their citizens' wealth with it.
Which is why the step action here is to avoid investing heavily in fiat currencies of heavily indebted nations with aging demographics that refuse to restructure their bad debts.
Exactly right.
Japan's story is a chilling preview of how difficult it is to escape a massive debt trap, even with advanced technology and a highly educated populace. Now, let's bring it home and look at the empire currently holding the world's reserve currency, facing its own massive, historically unprecedented debt hurdle.
The United States.
Lesson 14, Part 4. Looking ahead at the U.S. debt crisis.
Okay.
And again, before we analyze the U.S. political landscape, a mandatory disclaimer for our listeners. We want to remind you that discussing the internal political shifts in the United States, the rise of populist movements, the intense left versus right divide, the specific political figures, is done entirely impartially by us.
Right.
We are simply reflecting the source text analysis of historical cycles. We are not endorsing any political wing. We're diagnosing symptoms of a macroeconomic cycle.
Exactly. When you act as an economic historian, you have to look at political movements strictly as mechanical symptoms of where a country is in the big cycle. Political anger doesn't just appear out of nowhere. It is usually downstream of economic reality.
Right. So looking at those symptoms, the overarching question is, Are we currently living through the dynamics of the 1930s all over again?
According to Dalio's framework, the historical parallels are striking and, frankly, deeply concerning. His research places the United States and the existing Western-led world order as a whole roughly 90 to 95% of the way through the current 80-year big cycle.
We're near the end.
Yes. He defines this late phase as Stage 5.
And what are the defining hallmarks of a Stage 5 empire?
Historically, Stage 5 is characterized by three major mutually reinforcing symptoms. First, massive, unsustainable over-indebtedness at the government, corporate, and individual levels.
Sure.
Second, severe internal polarization, which is driven by massive gaps in wealth and values between different segments of the population. And third, rising external conflicts between the established great power and a rising challenger.
Check again. So, when a country hits Stage 5, it's not just an economic problem. It bleeds into every single facet of society.
The mechanics connecting these three symptoms are very logical if you follow the chain of cause and effect.
Walk me through the chain.
When a country's debt is incredibly high and the central bank uses tools like quantitative easing to manage it, we know that pumps up asset prices, right?
The stock market booms.
This creates a massive wealth gap. The people who own asset stocks, real estate, get incredibly wealthy. The people who rely solely on wages see their purchasing power eroded by inflation. The economic pain becomes highly localized in the middle and lower classes.
And when a large portion of the population feels the system is fundamentally rigged against them, they become intensely angry.
Exactly. You get vast gaps in wealth, which very quickly morph into vast gaps in values. In such an environment, traditional democratic processes begin to break down because compromise becomes politically toxic.
Right. If you compromise, you're a traitor.
Exactly. If you view the opposing political party not as fellow citizens with different ideas, but as an existential threat to your way of life, you don't want your leaders to compromise with them. You want your leaders to destroy them.
Which naturally leads to a dramatic change in the type of leadership that gets elected.
Yes. This intense internal disorder paves the way for the rise of more autocratic, nationalistic, and protectionist leaders on both ends of the political spectrum.
It's the rise of populism.
These are populist leaders who vow to fight for national strength and the working class, rather than prioritizing global harmony or free market orthodoxy. They are elevated by the population specifically to be fighters, not diplomats.
And how does that internal fighting affect gear number 3, the external geopolitical order?
Internal disorder directly feeds into external geopolitical weakness and conflict.
Because we're distracted.
Yes. When a nation is fiercely divided, fighting itself over budgets, elections, and cultural issues, it projects vulnerability abroad. Rival powers look at that internal chaos and feel emboldened to push boundaries, knowing the established power is too distracted to respond cohesively.
The source material speculates on how this geopolitical tension could play out, and it warns that alliances could change rapidly and in ways that would shock us today.
They absolutely could.
It reminds us that in the lead-up to World War II, Germany and Russia shifted from allies to mortal enemies almost overnight. And today, the economic battle lines are already drawn. The U.S.-China tech war over semiconductors and artificial intelligence, along with the massive decoupling of global supply chains we discussed, is already actively driving up national debt.
Yes.
Efficiency is being sacrificed on the altar of national security, which just accelerates the economic pressure of Stage 5. So the step action for you listening is to prepare for radical, unexpected changes that typically only happen once in an 80-year lifetime.
Like shifts away from multilateral cooperation toward unilateral survival of the fittest.
But I have to push back here.
Okay.
If this 80-year cycle is truly predictable, like the seasons of a year moving from spring to a bitter winter,
Yeah.
are we just helpless passengers on a train heading for a cliff? Or can the policymakers pulling the levers in Washington and at the Federal Reserve actually steer us toward a soft landing?
It's a mix of determinism and agency.
Okay.
Unpack that. The seasons will change. Winter is coming, mechanically speaking, because the mathematical burden of the debt is simply too high to be sustained at current interest rates without massive inflation or massive defaults.
Right.
But how we experience that winter, whether it is a complete societal collapse or a difficult but manageable restructuring, depends entirely on the policy choices made by leaders in real time. They cannot stop the cycle from turning, but they can actively manage the deleveraging process.
Which brings us to the ultimate million-dollar question. Is there a mathematical, practical way out of this trap?
Let's get into it.
Lesson 15. The 3% solution and preparing for the new reality. Is there an actual way for a deeply indebted empire to diffuse a massive debt bomb without utterly destroying the economy into depression or hyperinflating the currency into oblivion, like the Weimar Republic?
There is a historical precedent for it, and it's what the text refers to as a beautiful deleveraging, which we touched on with Japan.
Right.
But executing it requires masterful, almost surgical precision from policymakers. The optimal path requires them to perfectly balance two violently opposing economic forces.
Okay, what are the two forces?
On one side, you have deflationary measures. This means the government and central bank must force some level of debt restructuring. They have to allow some bad businesses to go bankrupt. They have to negotiate with creditors to take haircuts, meaning getting paid back less than they are owed, and they must implement some level of fiscal austerity.
This clears the rot, but it causes immense economic pain.
It's brutal. On the other side, to prevent that pain from spiraling into a 1930s depression, they have to simultaneously deploy inflationary measures.
The metis?
Yes. They have to print money, devalue the currency, and distribute capital to ease the squeeze and keep the banking system functioning.
So you have to match the pain of the defaults with the medicine of the money printer perfectly.
Exactly. If a country can restructure the bad debts, print just enough money to keep incomes rising slightly faster than the debt is growing, and spread that reduction of the debt burden out at a manageable, steady rate of about 3% or 4% per year, the total mathematical burden can be brought down to sustainable levels over a decade without causing unacceptable societal trauma.
But the margin for error is razor thin, isn't it?
Incredibly thin.
It sounds like walking a tightrope over a mile-deep canyon while juggling chainsaws.
Right.
If policymakers lean too far into the austerity and defaults, we fall into a deflationary depression and mass unemployment.
Right.
If they lean too far into the money printing and stimulus, we fall off the other side into hyperinflation and the destruction of the currency. But if they just carefully let out exactly 3% of the steam a year, we slowly make it across the tightrope safely.
That is the mechanical hope, and that is the defining challenge of our time. But executing a beautiful deleveraging requires leaders who are deeply pragmatic, highly cooperative, and capable of executing incredibly delicate, unpopular policy maneuvers during a time of intense stage 5 political polarization.
Which, as we've seen, is not exactly easy right now.
No, it's not.
So for a listener trying to prepare for this new reality, recognizing the phase we are in is critical for their own wealth preservation.
Absolutely.
The key takeaway, the step action from the mechanics we've discussed, is that holding traditional debt assets like long-term government bonds in a fiat currency during a major deleveraging phase is highly risky.
It is. You are effectively locking in a promise to be paid back in money that the government and central bank are actively mathematically required to devalue over time to solve their debt problem.
That is the harsh reality of MP3 and fiat deleveraging. Now, as we look to the future, we have to watch how all five forces interact, and the ultimate unpredictable wild card that could upend this entire historical cycle is gear number 5, technology.
It really is the great unknown.
How does technology alter the math?
Well, the compounding rate of innovation in artificial intelligence, advanced robotics, and quantum computing could theoretically provide an unprecedented, massive productivity boom.
Right.
If AI can make researchers, doctors, and engineers 10 times more productive, it could create enough real, tangible economic wealth to help offset and outgrow these massive debt burdens.
We could literally invent our way out of the hole. But it's a double-edged sword, isn't it?
It is the ultimate double-edged sword because those exact same technologies, AI, drone swarms, cyber warfare capabilities, could exponentially enhance the lethality and speed of military conflict, making the great power competition far more dangerous.
The text actually has a fascinating point about this tech war that gives a bit of perspective.
What did you think of it?
It highlights the absolute futility of trying to lock down technology through intellectual property wars. History shows that any great idea or technology that is openly used or deployed can typically be reverse engineered and replicated by a motivated rival nation within 6 to 12 months.
Yeah, you simply cannot put the technological genie back in the bottle.
No. Furthermore, despite all the fiery political rhetoric about nationalism and building walls, globalization as mathematical force is largely unstoppable. Global deal-making, capital flows, and deep interdependence are actually at all-time highs. Capital, like water, always finds a way around a dam.
It does. Which brings me to a final underlying thought that connects this massive macroeconomic framework directly to the human condition.
Leave us with a final thought, yeah.
We are currently entering an era where our technological capability to solve complex problems through artificial intelligence, biotechnology, nuclear fusion, advanced manufacturing is vastly greater than at any point in the history of our species.
We literally have the tools to create an era of unprecedented global abundance.
We do. Yet our human nature, our deeply ingrained historical tendency to fall into the exact same predictable cycles of greed, over-borrowing, intense internal tribal fighting, and external geopolitical conflict out of fear and pride, remains completely, stubbornly unchanged.
Wow.
The ultimate question for the next decade isn't about interest rates or bond yields. The question is, will our 21st century technology be used to finally transcend the big cycle, breaking the 80-year loop of boom and bust? Or will our ancient, unchanged human nature simply use those godlike technological tools to fight the exact same historical battles, just with unimaginably higher stakes?
Thank you for watching, everyone. I hope you found this content helpful. Please stay tuned for the next episode. Goodbye.